"Do not wave back." It started small, barely noticeable, a flicker in the corner of my vision. Every morning, the neighbor across the street would wave. Same time, same subtle smile. It was almost comforting, part of a rhythm I didn't realize had taken hold. At first, I told myself it was nothing. He lived alone in the White House with blue shutters, a place that never seemed to have visitors, deliveries, or the usual signs of life. Just him, standing there, waving. I began noticing patterns. Sometimes the wave came before I even reached the sidewalk, as if he knew exactly when I would appear. My reflection in the window blurred with his gesture, making me question what I had seen. One morning, he didn't wave. The blinds were drawn, dark and silent. Something hollow settled in my chest, a subtle wrongness I couldn't shake. That day, I left for work avoiding the street, feeling my pulse match the slow rhythm of my steps. The next day, he returned waving, but the movement felt off, mechanical in a way that made my skin crawl. I waved anyway, clinging to routine, even as my stomach knotted with unease. I tried ignoring it, but the feeling followed me inside. At night, I heard faint tapping on my windows, soft and deliberate, always aligning with my heartbeat. I stopped looking outside, but the tapping continued, whispering through walls, reaching into corners I thought were safe. The rhythm changed subtly over the following nights. Sometimes it was slow, dragging, like a footstep that shouldn't exist. Other times it was quick, nervous, as if it anticipated my movement. My reflection in mirrors began to shift unnaturally, catching gestures I didn't make. I told a friend, but they laughed, saying it sounded like paranoia. I didn't argue. Paranoia had no comfort in logic. Every evening, I noticed shapes behind the blinds, silhouettes shifting subtly, even when I knew the street was empty. I recorded the taps one night. Playback warped the sounds, stretching them in ways that didn't match the rhythm I heard. Between each knock, a faint whisper emerged, echoing my own name. It was impossible, but undeniable. By the fifth day, I couldn't bear leaving the house. I watched from the blinds, noticing the wave had changed. His arm moved endlessly, looping, tracing the air as if connected to a hidden mechanism. The fingers bent too far, like they weren't attached to muscle, but to something else. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of my floorboards felt like an answer. Every gust of wind rattled the window like a response. My mind twisted between imagination and reality. By morning, I felt hollow, as though I were being studied in the same way I observed him. I began mapping the street, noticing patterns that didn't exist before. Cars never parked in the same space twice. Shadows shifted in ways inconsistent with the sun. My neighbors' houses seemed to breathe subtly, siding and shutters warping as if alive. One night, I caught movement inside my reflection. I froze. The street was empty, no one outside. But my reflection raised its arm, mimicking the endless wave, a fraction slower than my own motion. My heartbeat raced in panic, but the reflection didn't stop. I tried closing my eyes, pulling blinds, turning away. Still, I heard it. Soft, deliberate tapping now, inside my apartment. It moved across floors and walls, circling me with patience, tracing invisible paths, whispering words just beyond comprehension. The next morning, I noticed something else. The reflection in my coffee cup moved independently. My arm raised slowly, unprompted, as if rehearsed. My eyes in the surface of the dark liquid were staring, but not at my real self. I tried leaving. Driving down the street, I saw the wave in every reflective surface. Store windows, car mirrors, even puddles on the asphalt mirrored the endless gesture. 1,000 versions of the neighbor, all moving in sync, all watching. I returned home with dread thickening around me. Every light in the neighborhood seemed off. Windows darkened, yet shapes shifted inside as if the houses themselves were alive. My own apartment felt smaller, closing in, the walls pressing just beyond perception. By midweek, I avoided mirrors entirely. I lived by memory and peripheral glimpses, counting shadows to reassure myself they weren't moving. But they did. Subtle shifts, just enough to disorient, to remind me I was no longer alone. The tapping escalated. It came from my closet, from the ceiling, from places I didn't know existed. The sound was deliberate, a rhythm tuned to me, as if learning my breathing, pacing my thoughts, predicting my actions. I dared to look at my reflection one last time. My face was pale, eyes wide, lips trembling. Behind me, in the reflection only, the neighbor waved, faster than he ever could in real life, fingers bending impossibly. The same subtle smile stretched wide across a face that had become entirely wrong. I ran to the door, only to find it locked, unexplainably bolted from the outside. My phone was dead, lights flickered, shadows bending toward me. Panic clawed through every rational thought, but I could still see the wave in every dark corner. Hours later, when I dared to peek, the street outside was empty again, silent, normal. The air carried the faintest metallic scent, like the memory of movement pressed into the neighborhood. My reflection had returned to normal, yet something deep inside me knew it wasn't me anymore. I called the police. They were polite, professional. They said the neighbor had died weeks ago, sitting by his window, hand raised in a wave, frozen by rigor mortis. The house was abandoned. I told them I'd seen him yesterday, waving. They looked at me like I was mistaken, confused. I left it at that. That night, I covered mirrors, blinds, everything reflective. Yet I couldn't sleep. At exactly the same time as the wave usually appeared, I felt a presence behind me, breathing faintly against the back of my neck. The next morning, a new neighbor moved in across the street. A man with a pale smile, standing at the window, waving. And when I looked closer, I noticed something in the reflection that made my blood run cold. It wasn't him waving. It was me, the borrowed face. It began the morning a new neighbor moved in across the street, a young man with a strange familiarity. His features were impossibly precise, as if he had been modeled on someone I should know, but couldn't place. I stopped mid-step on the sidewalk, staring. There was something in the curve of his jaw, the tilt of his head, the way he adjusted his shirt that made the hairs on my neck prickle. He didn't wave, but his eyes lingered long enough to feel like recognition. The first night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining that face in every reflective surface, tracing the same angles of my own features. Mirrors, windows, even the black screen of my phone seemed to hold it. I checked old photos of friends, coworkers, strangers I might have passed on the street. Nothing matched. Yet the sense of déjà vu persisted, a pressure in my memory it refused to release. The next morning, the man was gone from his yard. I told myself he was at work, grocery shopping, something mundane. But his car, a dark sedan, remained parked with the engine cold. By the third day, subtle changes appeared. Shadows in the hall of my apartment, elongated unnaturally. Faint creaks echoed through the floorboards that weren't mine. At night, I dreamt of someone walking behind me, breathing softly, always watching. When I glanced out the window, he was back across the street. His posture identical to the first day, but the angle of his gaze had shifted. He wasn't looking at me. Or perhaps he was, but with a perception I couldn't comprehend. The unease grew into obsession. I began tracking his movements, timing each appearance, noticing patterns that didn't seem human. He appeared precisely when I left my apartment, as if anticipating every action. I tried introducing myself. No response. I waved, but he never returned it. His lips curved faintly in something resembling a smile, but the eyes stayed distant, sharp, almost predatory in their focus. That night, I noticed something else. My reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't quite match me. The jawline was sharper, the cheekbones slightly higher. My eyes seemed wider than usual. I stepped back, blinking rapidly, but the image persisted. A week passed. Every glance out my window revealed the same scene. Him, still, unwavering, observing, sometimes leaning against the porch, railing as if studying an invisible map of my life. Sleep became fragmented. I dreamt of standing in my apartment while he mirrored every action, yet moved independently, creating a duality impossible to reconcile. I woke sweating, the memory of my own face twisted in reflection. Then, one evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I froze, heart thudding. The knock came again, deliberate, measured. Hesitant, I opened the door to an empty porch. Only a small envelope lay there, my name scrawled in handwriting that seemed familiar yet alien. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of me, sitting on my couch, reading. The timestamp marked last night, a moment I could not have been observed from the street. My hands shook as I turned it over. Nothing, no message, just my face staring back. The next day, I saw him standing in the middle of the street, staring directly at my apartment window. When I looked closer, I noticed a subtle detail. His features had shifted. The cheekbones, the eyes, the nose, small movements, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I began to avoid mirrors, recording myself on my phone to reassure my perception. Playback disturbed me. My recorded movements sometimes lagged slightly behind what I remembered, as if someone else had practiced mimicking me in real time. The building started to feel wrong. Stairwells seemed longer. Hallways bent subtly when I walked. Shadows stretched at odd angles, not consistent with light sources. I questioned my own memory of layouts I had navigated for months. At night, tapping began behind the walls, a soft rhythm, almost conversational. I whispered into the dark, asking questions, half in fear, half in curiosity. Sometimes it answered with silence, other times with a soft echo of my own words. One evening, I dared to look out the window. The man was closer, standing under the streetlight, face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. My reflection shifted behind me as I glanced. His silhouette merged with mine, perfectly synchronized. I backed away, only to find every reflective surface in my apartment showing him in place of me, except my phone screen, which still displayed my actual image. The discrepancy was subtle, yet horrifying. The next night, I noticed movement in my closet. A door had never been ajar. Inside, a faint outline stood, crouched and still. I dared not approach. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet curiosity rooted me. I began hearing whispers. Names, words I could not identify, spoken softly, layered over my own breathing. The sound came from all around, sometimes from behind mirrors, sometimes from the ceiling. I couldn't locate the source. Then the photograph appeared again, slipped under my door. This time, it was different. Two people, me and him, sitting side by side on my couch, the same pose I had assumed hours earlier. The lighting unnatural, the shadows wrong. I realized I could not distinguish between observation and reflection. Every surface, every sound, every movement was suspect. Someone or something had learned the rhythm of my life, the contours of my body, and was practicing. I left the apartment for hours, walking the streets, attempting normalcy. Yet he appeared everywhere. Across the street, in the reflection of store windows, in shadows behind parked cars. Each time, a subtle mismatch, his head tilted slightly differently, his posture imperfectly mine. By the third week, I noticed an impossible truth. My reflection sometimes lagged behind my actual movements. My own gestures occasionally felt foreign, preempted by a version of me that existed only in mirrors. I stopped leaving the apartment entirely. Meals, water, everything delivered. watched carefully. My body grew thin, my hair unkempt, but I was alive, mostly. Until the night I woke to movement behind my bedroom mirror. It shifted silently, pressing against the glass. Then, from inside the reflective surface, a face emerged. My face, indistinguishable from my own, but wrong eyes wider, lips curved in a cruel mockery of my expressions. I stumbled backward, tripping over furniture. The mirrored figure leaned forward, pressing closer. Its hand mirrored my motion exactly, as if learning how to replace me. The street outside was silent, but I felt the weight of eyes everywhere, watching, recording, preparing. The next morning, the new neighbor was gone. The house empty, blinds drawn, as if nothing had existed at all. Yet I knew. I checked my reflection in every surface. My movements were no longer my own. Occasionally, when I paused, I caught a glimpse of him behind me, copying, perfecting, waiting. I fled the apartment the next night, leaving everything behind. On the street, the houses all seemed strangely alive, their windows twisting, reflections shifting unnaturally. I ran, unable to distinguish reality from reflection, sound from echo. Weeks later, I returned once, briefly, to gather my belongings. The street was quiet. The White House stood empty, still and unthreatening in daylight. But as I passed, I noticed the neighbor's silhouette in the window. I didn't wave. And when I looked at my own reflection that night, I realized something impossible. My face was smiling back, waving. I had left. But a part of me had stayed behind. The quiet one upstairs. It started with the softest sound barely there, like the scrape of a chair leg. It was too faint to care about until it began repeating. Always at 3:12 a.m., always above my ceiling. Always the same rhythm. At first, I assumed it was a night owl neighbor, maybe a gamer or insomniac. Thin walls, old buildings, it happens. But the longer I listened, the more I noticed it wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like breathing. Every night, the sound grew clearer. Something dragging, then stopping. A pause, a thump, then dragging again. It wasn't furniture anymore. It was movement, heavy and deliberate, as if someone crawled just above my bed. I checked the tenant list posted near the elevator. Unit 3B above me was marked vacant. It had been for 3 months, according to the faded printout taped to the wall. That night, I recorded the noise on my phone. The playback made my chest tighten. It wasn't dragging anymore. It was pacing. Slow, uneven footsteps across the ceiling, ending right above my pillow. I tried telling the landlord, but he brushed it off. Said pipes expand, old floors shift, that kind of thing. He didn't even look up from his phone. I didn't mention the vacant unit. The next night, the pacing stopped. Silence until 3:12 again. Then a single knock. One sharp rap from the ceiling directly above. I froze. It felt like an answer to my attention. When I moved my bed to the opposite wall, the knocking followed the next night. Same time, same tone, as if it tracked me. I stopped sleeping altogether. By the 5th night, I noticed something new. The noise no longer came from above. It was from the wall by my closet. A faint scratching, like fingernails tracing inside the drywall. I pressed my ear to the wall. There was breathing on the other side. Slow, deep, and patient. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, lips trembling as if trying to match its rhythm. Morning made everything absurd. I told myself I was hearing pipes, wind, rodents, normal things. But when I looked closer at the ceiling paint, I saw fingerprints small, faint indentations pressed into the plaster above my bed. They weren't mine. I called the building's maintenance number and asked if anyone was renovating upstairs. The man on the line paused too long before answering. He said there's no key for 3B. It's sealed pending inspection. Sealed. That word stayed with me. That night, I couldn't stop staring at the ceiling. The air felt wrong, heavy like before a storm. I whispered into the dark, asking if anyone was there. The knock came instantly. 1, 2, 3, each strike in perfect sync with my heartbeat. I packed a bag and decided to sleep in my car. But when I reached the stairwell, I saw footprints in the dust bare feet, small, leading upward toward the locked door of 3B. I followed, gripping my phone light like a weapon. The lock was rusted, the handle taped over with "Do not enter" written in faded ink. I pressed my ear to it anyway. Nothing, just silence. Then, from inside, a voice whispered back the exact sound of my own breathing. Perfectly mirrored, half a second delayed, like a recording that learned me. I stumbled backward. My phone light flickered. The door creaked just slightly and stopped. Dust drifted out through the gap, carrying a faint metallic smell, old and damp. I went back downstairs shaking, locked my door, and pushed the dresser against it. At 3:12, something pressed down from the ceiling, slow enough to bend the plaster inward above me. It stayed there, weightless but present. I could hear faint laughter through the pressure, like someone amused by my fear. The weight lifted after exactly 1 minute. I didn't move for hours. The next morning, maintenance came to inspect water lines. The worker, a quiet man in a gray uniform, looked pale when I mentioned 3B. He said he'd been in there once, long ago. Before it was sealed. He said it wasn't empty then. Someone had built a crawl space between the ceilings, thin enough to hide a body, wide enough to move around if you were patient. He told me the tenant's name was on the lease for both 3A and 3B. No one ever saw her leave. When I asked what happened, he just said, "Sometimes the quiet ones never move out." That night, I pushed my dresser under the ceiling marks and tried to ignore the smell of dust and metal. The air felt warmer than usual. At 3:12, the knock came again, 3 times. Then silence. I whispered, asking what it wanted. The voice answered this time, not from above, but behind my headboard. It said my name, slowly, correctly. I looked up just as the ceiling began to crack, a thin split running directly across the plaster. Dust fell in soft streams. Something was pressing against it from the other side. Not a hand, not a face, something in between. Skin stretched too thin, fingers bending backward, head sideways as if studying me. The plaster bulged, holding it back like wet paper. I backed toward the door, whispering that I'd leave, that I'd never come back. The sound stopped. The bulge retreated. When I stepped into the hall, the air was still. I looked up at the ceiling again. The marks were gone. The next morning, 3B was listed as occupied on the elevator notice. No name, just the word active. I left that night, didn't even grab my things. I drove until the gas light came on and slept in the car at a rest stop. Before I dozed off, I checked my phone. The recording I'd made of the ceiling sounds had updated by itself. The timestamp now said 3:12 a.m., recorded today. When I played it, I heard a whisper. The same breath, the same dragging. Only this time, it wasn't above me. It was outside the car. And it said, "There's room between the floors." They're not supposed to be there. It started the first night we moved into the building. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and something metallic, faint, like iron in water. I unpacked boxes while my family slept. In the corner of the kitchen, shadows shifted unnaturally, although nothing should have been moving. By midnight, I heard the first sound, a soft scraping from the hallway outside the door. Too deliberate for settling pipes, too light for heavy footsteps. I froze. The air thickened, and every tiny creak made me flinch. I told myself it was normal old buildings groan, but the scraping continued nightly, always starting around the same time, circling the apartment before fading. It followed us like a presence that learned our routines. The next morning, the building felt empty but wrong. Units above us were dark. No mail, no signs of occupancy. Yet I saw lights flicker in windows where the tenants hadn't moved in. Brief glimmers, as if someone or something was there and gone in a blink. By the third day, small details began to unsettle me. A cup from the kitchen vanished, only to appear in a different spot. Drawers left closed were ajar. A jacket left on a chair appeared folded neat, as if someone had handled it, invisible. I started checking the tenant list. Units 3B and 4A were vacant. They had been for months, according to management. Yet noises persisted from those exact apartments. Scraping, dragging, faint thumps, sometimes like furniture being shifted slowly. One evening, I noticed something in the hallway mirror across from our door. A figure reflected there, standing at the far end of the hall. It wasn't supposed to exist. My family was in the living room. I was alone in the kitchen, yet the shape mirrored a human posture, still and watching. I told myself it was imagination. Old mirrors play tricks. But the next night, the figure appeared again, closer, in the same mirror. My own reflection remained still while it shifted subtly, tilting its head as if studying me, learning. I stopped leaving doors unlocked. Windows stayed shut, but lights turned on without my touch. My phone and laptop powered up when I hadn't used them. Emails opened on screens, cursor blinking in empty text boxes. Nothing was typed, but the devices were awake. Footsteps became heavier. I counted them, pacing in patterns that didn't match anyone moving through the building. At night, the sounds came from above, below, beside us. Sometimes directly behind walls, other times under floors. My family noticed. They said it was the building settling. I knew it wasn't. I tried video recording the apartment. Reviewing footage terrified me. Shapes flickered in corners, impossible shadows bending around walls. Every reflection captured things I didn't see with my eyes, silhouettes moving independently of light and object. One afternoon, I ventured into the hallway. Units 3B and 4A were still vacant. I pressed my ear to 3B's door. Silence at first, then breathing. Slow, deliberate, impossibly close. I stepped back, heart hammering, certain no one could be inside. That night, the sounds escalated, scraping across floors, dragging along walls, tapping in rhythms that matched my own heartbeat. Objects slid across counters when I wasn't looking. The air smelled metallic, like something old and sharp. By the fifth day, paranoia had become suffocating. Every reflection, every doorway, every corner seemed to hide watchers. I couldn't step into hallways without a sense of multiple eyes. The building itself felt alive, breathing through the walls, folding space in subtle, impossible ways. One evening, a neighbor knocked. A woman from across the hall, polite and smiling. She mentioned she heard us unpacking. But she was supposed to be on vacation, according to the management office. When I asked, she paused too long, then smiled again, heading back down the hall. The next night, the footsteps came in multiples. Heavy, light, fast, slow. They traced every room in our apartment. My family heard them too. My daughter whispered that she saw people standing at corners that didn't exist, shadows like thin bodies pressed against walls that shouldn't hold weight. I stayed awake, watching, waiting. The shapes moved when I looked away, vanishing when I focused. The apartment felt smaller, hallways elongated. Corners bent unnaturally. The ceiling bulged at angles that had no reason to bend. I checked the management office records. Units marked vacant had no active leases. Yet the sounds persisted. Footsteps, voices murmuring behind walls, furniture sliding across floors, scratches from ceilings and pipes. Something had entered the building long before we arrived. One night, I saw it. Through a reflection on the oven door, a figure moved in the hallway. Tall, thin, faceless. Its posture mirrored the neighbors I had seen casually in passing, yet its proportions were wrong, limbs stretching impossibly. It moved silently, observing, waiting. I tried photographing it. The camera captured nothing but static, faint blurs, shadows that didn't match light. But when I looked at the screen, the figure's head tilted toward me, even though the lens was pointed elsewhere. The family grew restless. My wife said she felt watched constantly, even in rooms we thought safe. Doors I locked were unlocked the next day. Drawers were opened. The refrigerator hummed at night when no one was home. I stayed in our bedroom, laptop open, recording everything. The screen flickered, shadows crawling across it. When I glanced at the hallway reflection, I saw multiple figures lined up, their faces blank, hands folded, waiting. One of them turned slowly to me. By the 10th night, sleep had abandoned us. Every small sound made me jump. The apartment had become a cage of reflections at impossible angles. My family whispered in fear, trying to convince me we imagined it, but I knew. They were real, and they weren't supposed to exist. I tried leaving. Hallways twisted. Doors I opened led to other rooms, sometimes back into our own apartment. Windows looked out into walls that hadn't existed before. The building had learned me, folded me into its architecture. I called the police. They arrived, walking the hallways with flashlights. The units were empty. No bodies, no tenants. They smiled politely, said nothing. When they left, I noticed one of their reflections stayed behind in the hallway mirror, lingering just long enough to vanish when I looked directly. The next evening, I found an envelope slipped under our door. Inside were photographs. Our family, asleep, recorded from angles impossible to capture. Units 3B and 4A, visible in the background, empty in reality, but full in the images. Figures moved in the corners, watching. I realized then that the building had always been alive. Its floors, walls, and hallways folded space around entities that mimicked neighbors. They could appear anywhere, silently, bending reality to observe us. I left everything behind and fled. The street outside seemed normal. Cars drove, lights blinked. People walked as if nothing were wrong. But the apartment building still loomed, dark, silent, breathing. Weeks later, I returned to gather personal items. The building appeared quiet in daylight, yet the windows of 3B and 4A glimmered faintly, shadows stretching inside like thin fingers reaching for us. When I peered into a reflection of the lobby, I saw them. Multiple figures, faceless, standing in corners and doorways, perfectly still. Their posture mirrored the neighbors I had observed, yet each was impossibly thin, impossibly long, observing. I didn't wave, I didn't speak, I didn't breathe too loudly. I walked past the mirrors, avoiding reflections entirely. The building exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. At night, the tapping returned. Behind walls, under floors, along ceilings. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, patient, learning, waiting. I left the city soon after. But in dreams, in reflective surfaces of unfamiliar buildings, I still see the shapes. Watching, always mimicking, waiting for the next family to move in. They were never supposed to exist. And yet, every time I think I'm safe, I hear the faintest scraping echoing from nowhere. A reminder that the building still remembers us. The guest who stayed. It started when I answered the door to a knock I wasn't expecting. No one was supposed to visit, yet a man stood there with a suitcase and a polite smile. He claimed to be a friend of a friend, someone I had never met. I hesitated, but the door clicked open. He stepped inside, carrying a small bag, introducing himself with a name I would later forget. His eyes lingered too long on the apartment, scanning every corner, memorizing spaces I didn't realize were being watched. At first, it was harmless. He drank coffee in the kitchen, browsed my bookshelves, asked mundane questions. I assumed he would leave that night. But hours passed, and the polite smile never wavered. By midnight, I realized he hadn't slept. He sat in the living room, silent, unmoving, watching shadows shift as if the apartment itself were performing for him. His presence made the air colder, thicker, every creak amplified. The next morning, he asked to use the bathroom. I followed. The bathroom mirror reflected him, but something was off. His eyes didn't blink, lips curved faintly in a slow, unnatural smile. I thought I imagined it, yet the feeling lingered. I told him it was late, that he should leave. He nodded, agreed politely. I went to bed, thinking the ordeal was over. But around 2 a.m., I woke to soft footsteps pacing the living room. He hadn't moved from the couch in my memory, yet the sound was unmistakable. The following days became a nightmare of small impossibilities. Objects shifted subtly when I wasn't looking. Drawers opened slightly. Lights flickered. His silhouette appeared in reflections, but vanished when I turned to check. I called friends, desperate. None had seen him. None had visited. I began documenting everything. Cameras captured faint blurs, shadows stretching across rooms in impossible ways. The man appeared in some frames, absent in others. One evening, I tried confronting him. The apartment felt larger, hallways longer, corners bending. He smiled politely, as if he knew the question before it was asked. Words caught in my throat. My voice felt borrowed, inadequate. By the week's end, I realized I hadn't seen him eat, sleep, or use the bathroom. Yet the apartment smelled faintly of old cologne, his presence lingering in corners. My reflection sometimes moved independently, hinting at a mimicry I couldn't control. He began asking questions about my routine, not directly, but subtly. Where I left keys, how I slept, when I showered. I answered out of habit, unaware that each answer was building something I didn't understand. One night, I woke to soft scratching at my bedroom door. It circled, paused, then retreated. The tapping wasn't random. It was deliberate, patient, designed to train me to listen, to notice, to anticipate. I tried sleeping elsewhere. Friends offered couches, hotel rooms. The man was always there when I returned, waiting, smiling. He never entered directly, but his presence was absolute, inescapable, pressing into every reflective surface. I attempted to leave permanently, bags packed, door unlocked. I walked into the street, breathing in cold night air, convinced I was free. Yet when I glanced back, lights glimmered in the apartment windows. Shadows shifted in a rhythm that mirrored my own heartbeat. I returned once, reluctantly, to retrieve personal items. The apartment was silent. No furniture moved, no footsteps. Yet in every mirror, his reflection lingered, half hidden behind corners, peering at me with patience. Weeks later, I received a package. Inside was a note. You left too much behind. Nothing else. No sender. No address. But the handwriting, once foreign, now felt familiar, as if it had always been my own. I realized then that he had never truly been a guest. He had entered without permission. Yes, but more than that. He had learned me, memorized my habits, my space, and occupied a part of my perception that no one else could reach. Every mirror, reflective surface, even shadows in rooms I left empty, carried his presence. A subtle shift in shape, a faint tilt of posture, a smile too slow, too precise. I was haunted not only by his form, but by the knowledge that it had learned to mimic me. I began avoiding mirrors entirely, covering reflective surfaces, closing blinds. Yet at night, the apartment itself felt alive, stretching, bending, as if accommodating him in every corner I hadn't noticed. I left permanently. Hotels, friends' apartments, relatives' homes. it didn't matter. In every reflective surface, every dark corner, every shifting shadow, I saw him waiting, smiling, patient, learning. Sometimes I catch myself imitating his movements unknowingly, gestures I would never make consciously, reflecting a presence I cannot escape. I am no longer entirely myself, and he remains in my old apartment, waiting, the guest who never left.